Hello everyone, and welcome back to FOSS, our course on open source software and how it is changing the software industry. We are now in the second part of the course where we will be talking about the business models in quotation marks that make open source software sustainable, how it works from an industry perspective. For that, I last time gave an overview of how the software industry works. And now I will turn to one of the most interesting and also deepest topics of how the software industry is organizing its software development specifically around open source software in the form of developer foundations. This is also one of the aspects of how open source software is highly innovative by giving us new again in quotation marks, business models, how companies work with each other for business purposes and are developing open source software while doing so. The topic today, open source developer foundations, is one of the older ones, one of the original ones which led to the establishment of new legal entities, juristic persons here. The non-profit foundations, developer foundations, led by the Apache Software Foundation in 1999 and the OSDL, a precursor to the Linux Foundation, shortly thereafter. And as we will see, there are plenty of open source software foundations these days, developer foundations. It's one of open source software developer foundations are one of the two business models of non-profit open source software. They have not been created to make money right away. Hence, all the engagement and investment into them is basically a subsidy because money is being made elsewhere. But they are very important for the overall open source software ecosystem. Next to developer foundations, we will also look next time then at user foundations. In addition to these non-profit foundations, there are for-profit open source business models, most notably the open source distributor firms and the single vendor firms, open source firms. And then naturally there are, like everywhere, consulting firms. So then, here's my definition. An open source developer foundation is a non-profit organization, call it a foundation or a consortium, depends, with the purpose of managing the development of non-differentiating open source software. So the task of such a foundation, non-profit foundation, is to manage and develop the software. So it's not just passively sitting by or just sponsoring. The members or the parties involved do actively engage in the development of the software. And it's open source software that is not differentiating, meaning many get to benefit from this software and hence it's not a competitive advantage in itself among or held by one particular company. It's open source software, so the software is being made available to the general public by way of an open source software license. As an organization, it has members and sometimes natural people are allowed. More often these days they are not. But typically in developer foundations, you'll find companies as members, specifically then software vendors, product vendors, service providers around products, and consulting firms, the usual suspects. So the motivation for open source developer foundations are manifold. The initial historic one was to support and protect the developers and the open source projects. So the foundations were created to protect developers from lawsuits, to make sure the projects are usable and maybe if necessary to defend trademarks and other intellectual property rights associated with the projects in court. Not soon thereafter, industry learned that open source developer foundations are a great way of joining forces in a structured way, and that it helps them create a more competitive ecosystem where those in the ecosystem can benefit from that increased competitiveness. Specifically, it leads to increasing the share of the customer wallet, as I call it, meaning making more money off customers without hurting the customer necessarily, reaching more price-sensitive customers and growing the addressable market. Then, as an organizational measure, open source software foundations have the purpose or are motivated as a means to create a fair and equal playing field for the members of the foundation. Assumption, of course, is that's the intent, so the foundation needs to be done right, and then it can provide a fair and equal playing field. Usually this means regulating access to intellectual property rights, access to marketing channels on how to reach customers associated with the software perhaps, but also making sure that one's own products that typically build on the open source projects are aligned with the product roadmap and match the development cycles and what have you that the open source project is performing. So now let's look at these motivations and the variations in developer foundations in turn. So here's a statement from the Apache Software Foundation, maybe still the gold standard for open source software foundations. From its website, the Apache Software Foundation provides an established framework for intellectual property. Hence, it regulates rights around the intellectual property and financial contributions, gives it some stability, and that simultaneously limits contributors' potential legal exposure. Meaning, if you're a developer and you contribute, should anyone try to sue you for, say, warranties or neglect, the Apache Software Foundation will step in and defend itself, because it will not be heard directed at you any longer, will defend itself in court. All right. So that's what I just explained. The initial historic motivation: support people, support and protect the projects. Noteworthy is perhaps that in addition to the legal representation, the foundation also needs and wants to make sure that its software is usable. So what we discussed under product governance a while back also applies to open source projects. Users of the software want to be able to rely on the labels, want to be able to rely on what it says on the outside of some open source project. So open source foundations typically or ideally make sure that only license compliant code gets in there, and that whatever they say about the software is actually true, so that users can feel safe in using the software. And so that it fulfills its purpose, because open source software that users don't feel safe using will not be used, and hence the project is failing. Anyway, so the second motivation, which came after the initial historic one, was the recognition by companies how important open source software is commercially and to their products. The second motivation is to create a stronger and more competitive ecosystem. This takes the form in three main ways. It helps open source software managed by a developer foundation by having companies join forces, helps increase the share of the customer's wallet that the company relying on the open source software can gain. It allows the same company to reach more price-sensitive customers and to grow the addressable market. So let's look at that in turn, because that may not be obvious, and it requires a little bit of microeconomics. So increasing the share of wallet. For that, you need to understand that Customers, banks, insurances, or any customer typically wants to purchase or pay for a so-called solution. They don't care about, unless they're a software company, they don't really care about the software in itself. They care about having their problem solved. And that means they buy software typically in the form of a solution stack. They ask some implementer, make this application work for us, and with the application, say with an SAP Business Suite, comes an operating system and a database. So the customer is paying not just for one, but for multiple products that need to be integrated and that need to work with each other. I'm simplifying the situation here by assuming that in order to solve the customer problem, the customer needs to have a platform and then the application or whatever it is that the company wants to sell to the customer. Here I call it the dependent product dependent on the platform. To show that for any company to sell its product, it may have to sell a license, or it implicitly has to sell a license to some platform they build on. And that may be the traditional way of how it is. You sell SAP Business Suite, you also sell a Microsoft license and an Oracle license. Some would say, strongly simplifying, but you get the idea. So then, you maybe just share the revenue. Half, 50% goes to the application, the dependent product here. The other 50% goes to the closed source platform. Now then, if only the company trying to sell the dependent product could replace the platform it needs, the expensive closed source platform it needs, with a much less expensive open source platform, think replacing Windows with Linux, then the price point for that platform drastically falls because open source is typically cheaper, and you can have competition around, say, Linux, so the price points are simply lower. If then the price point or the license that goes to that flows from the customer's wallet, from its budget, to paying for the platform becomes lower, more money is left for the company selling the actual application that provides the business value that the customer wants to see as part of the solution. So the customer may not necessarily, if they get the company may not necessarily, if they get the customer to switch from Windows to Linux, be able to increase the price of their application, of the dependent product here, but they may be able to perhaps sell more. In any way, the money in the customer's wallet is a bit more loose because suddenly there's breathing space. There is more available to possibly be spent on additional modules or additional functionality by the dependent product vendor. So by replacing a closed source product with an open source product, companies, vendors can get more of the customer's budget or wallet, metaphorically speaking. This actually continues as you compress as a vendor compresses the money that goes to a closed source platform, because they make it possible that an open source platform will be put in as a replacement. It actually also becomes possible to reach more price-sensitive customers. Look at the left side. With a closed source platform and a dependent product on top of it, if you share 50-50, that defines how many customers you can reach. Some customers have enough money, some don't, some where there's a cutoff, which is where the combined license fees are still affordable to the customer, and so forth. Now, with a lower price point for the closed source platform because it's being replaced with an open source platform, the combined price goes lower, which means that now the vendor of the dependent product can reach more price sensitive customers. So it's simply more customers that can be reached, while there's also a higher margin available if they are able to take advantage of that, which you often can by way of price list, rebates, etc. So you slide down the demand curve, thereby increase your reach and reach more price-sensitive customer and ultimately make more money as a vendor who is able to replace any closed source dependencies in the solution stack with open source software that is cheaper. And finally, also if your dependent product builds on an open source platform and by way of an open source foundation, you make that open source platform better and richer, and it gets more traction with customers in the data centers of customers. It means that more customers are based on the open source rather than the closed source platform, and thereby the addressable market, meaning the number of customers you can sell to, gets larger too. Imagine that your product runs on top of Windows and Linux, but that your product runs only on Linux. Well, you can only sell to data centers, to customers with data centers that support Linux. So in the past, you may have had to support both Windows and Linux, but if Linux was only to fully push Windows out of data centers, then all data centers would be running Linux, and your product only needs to run on Linux as well, and hence you are in the largest possible addressable market. So that's another reason to support open source developer foundations who develop such software. Okay, so and the third one is third motivation for developer foundations is to create a fair and equal playing field for the members of the foundations, because what the foundation does is to regulate the access to any intellectual property rights that may be needed to make use of the software. Typically, that's a trademark. If you are selling services for WordPress, then you need to be allowed to use the label WordPress and the associated trademarks, and you usually get that by joining the WordPress Foundation and behaving according to its rules and regulations. But such foundations may also manage conferences, so there are important marketing channels by which you can reach your customers and your markets. And also you always want to make sure that whatever you build onto a platform or an application, that whatever you do there, you know what's coming and what's changing, so that your products are aligned with the underlying software. So you may wonder how serious all of that is. Well, here's a little quiz. Imagine you've developed some open source software and it really gained traction, so it's got users and it gets contributions, but you're the project owner, you own the GitHub repository, maybe you own the trademark to the name, or you own the domain right away. So how could you harass your users, and by extension, what would your users not like to see, meaning how could they possibly gang up on you with the goal of making sure nothing bad happens to them. So I'll wait a bit while you discuss this. TA, please take over. Well, as you can see, I've listed already the basics here. The first way of annoying your users or preventing them from using the software as they'd like to is by the associated intellectual property rights. The copyright and perhaps patents aren't usually the problem because your software has a license, and if it's a modern open source license, then it's pretty clear on copyright and patents, and nothing can go wrong for the users. But there's the trademark. So there's a label, there's a name, and an open source license typically doesn't say anything about the trademark. So if someone were to use your software and were to claim they're providing services around your software, but they don't have any rights to use that name of your software and you've got a trademark, well, then you could simply send them a cease and desist letter asking them to stop using your trademark. So you could shut them out of business here, or at least hurt them badly because they may not be allowed to use the project name any longer. I'm not saying that anyone should do that, but I'm saying that it's a constant threat that hangs over the head of anyone who wants to use some particular open source software as part of their business. And because that's an investment, they want clarity around using trademarks, for example. So they will actually, so companies are actually not going to join an ecosystem and provide products and services and consulting for some open source software if there isn't clarity around the usage of the trademark, etc. Now, hard intellectual property rights are one thing. There's also the positional advantage that the owner or the original creator of the software typically has. They are the go-to person, social leadership they provide can lead the software project in one direction. So whoever employs the original creator has a stronger handle on where the project is headed. That's one reason why, for example, Linus Torvalds doesn't work for any particular company any longer, but is employed by the Linux Foundation, so that there aren't any fights over him, trying to influence him to lead the Linux kernel into a particular direction. Other intellectual property rights that may be important is simply owning certain domains. This is typically coupled with trademarks, but it's separate intellectual property. You are the owner of a domain, and if that domain is somehow important because it's the first thing that potential customers will type into a browser, well, that needs to be regulated. So users, companies who want to engage with a particular open source project will take notice of that and will be very cautious if they don't think things are kosher. Finally, but this is really the worst of the worst in this kitchen cabinet of poisonous things to do to an open source project, the original developer could stop having an open development process and rather develop privately and then only dump code once in a while. So there is no open development process any longer. Companies, users can't really engage and contribute. That will really screw up a project and will make other companies stay and shy away from the project. So open source developer foundations are supposed to fix all that. Here's a summary of the potential problems I already went through and how they can be solved. So potential abuse of copyright and patents, that's solved by a license. Abuse of trademarks, well, that's what you need the foundation for. Abuse of social leadership can also be solved by the foundation, maybe if necessary by employing the project leaders. A poor or bad or deliberately abusive process, well, the foundation needs to get a handle on this process and by way of open governance, make that process transparent and open to input from any of the involved parties. Other IP rights like domains also that can be solved by the foundation by making the foundation the owner of any such intellectual properties. So that's what a foundation has to do. And if someone sets up a foundation or has no foundation so that all of this is not properly regulated, then the open source project is not attractive from a commercial perspective because things could go wrong. If you wanted to engage and invest resources by learning about the project and selling services for it, for example, then you run the risk that the rug will be pulled out from under your feet. So you create a foundation. Why don't you just stick to plain old community or open source? Well, exactly for what I just explained. If it's only a license, you do not have rules and regulations around trademarks, things like that. You don't have the support for good open source governance. People are not protected. You can't represent the project in court, etc., etc. A foundation simply makes projects more sustainable, live longer, by also removing dependencies on any one particular person too much. When you create an open source foundation, you could also argue, well, why does it have to be open source? We'll just create a consortium and things are only available to those who are paying members of the consortium. So you're missing out on the overall benefits of open source. Well, an open source consortium or foundation, I use these terms interchangeably here, is simply a consortium in the first place. But using an open source approach, you are benefiting from increasingly well-established legal frameworks, the licensees, people understand those. People also understand how to work together on open source. Compare that with you inventing your own consortium, not an open source one. You have to do all the legal paperwork yourself. You've got to set up all the rules yourself. You've got to explain it and sell it to anyone who might want to participate. And it's all one-offs. It's all very specific, and you have very little certainty in the courts because, well, it's you and it's never been tried before. While open source, again, has this being increasingly well understood and leads to more certainty in various aspects, from, again, any lawsuits around licenses all the way to how to collaborate in software development. So you get your collaboration model legally supported, faster at lower costs, because you're relying increasingly on templates and examples of how to do it right by looking at other open source foundations. All of this means a higher likelihood of success at the end. Okay, so when we look at developer foundations, so far I mentioned the Apache Software Foundation as the perhaps original developer foundation. When we look at developer foundations today, we'll see that there are different variants of it, and simplifying, I identify here two types of developer foundations, which have the same motivations but behave slightly differently and have slightly different foci. So there's the Application Developer Foundation and the Platform Developer Foundation. In the case of an application developer foundation, the focus is on developing jointly, managing jointly the development of a particular open source application, for which then the involved companies typically provide add-ons, provide services, sell consulting. And examples would be WordPress Foundation, Drupal Foundation, Blender Foundation, as well-known established open source projects. And then there are the platform developer foundations, which focus on the development of a particular, often industry scale software platform that's not an application directly sold to customers. Rather, the platform is embedded into any larger project or product by the involved companies. And so examples of such platform developer foundations are the Linux Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, the OpenStack Foundation, etc. The platform developer foundations, it's a matter of degree here, tend simply to be larger, more heavy-hitting in terms of the involved companies, because in the software industry, as we've discussed last time, the struggle is always about who owns the platform. Which is not to say that applications can't be viewed as platforms. They certainly are platforms on a much smaller level than the typical industry platforms we usually talk about. They are platforms for plugins and services. So many of the arguments apply equally. But again, it's a matter, it's a difference of degree and of course also ultimately in market volume, market size. So let's look at the application developer foundations a little bit more. Here you see some examples I picked from the web. There's the WordPress Foundation. Let's see whether I remember them by the logo. So there's WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, Plone, KDE and GNOME, Blender, the open source Geospatial Foundation, the Document Foundation, Mozilla Foundation, Wikimedia Foundation, Free Software Foundation. So plenty. And there are many more. What we can see here is some topics are simply hot or were hot at some point of time. For example, content management systems. So the whole first row here is all blogs, that's WordPress, but then content management systems. So Drupal, Joomla, Plone are basically competitors. KDE and GNOME too, etc. We can see how some foundations are named like their projects, like their projects, and sometimes not. We see some foundations host several applications, like Mozilla hosts both Firefox and Thunderbird. And the Free Software Foundation hosts any number of free software projects. So it doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping between a project and a foundation. And there are even foundations where the software is just a side effect, like the Wikimedia Foundation is basically host to the MediaWiki software which operates the Wikimedia Foundation projects. So the Wikimedia Foundation is only interested in MediaWiki to the extent that it supports its projects, which is actually a problem because it doesn't really care so much about the commercial interests of anyone providing services or products around MediaWiki, and so it's even though MediaWiki is the most popular wiki of all, I believe. In the enterprise, it's a different wiki software that's leading the charge, which would be Atlassian's Confluence. And that's probably because, well, anyone interested in providing product services around MediaWiki doesn't really have a foundation where they can join and work together, because the Media Foundation doesn't quite care about it. Because it cares about Wikipedia. That's Wikipedia and other Wikimedia Foundation projects. That's their mission. So as an example, here's the WordPress Foundation from its website. The foundation exists to ensure free access and perpetuity to the projects. The foundation will be responsible for protecting the trademarks, the WordPress, WordCamp, and related trademarks. It's a 501c3 non-profit organization. So 501c3 are really for the public interest. These are true foundations. And the WordPress Foundation takes over all the intellectual property rights. So at some point of time took them away from the original owners, like the software company behind WordPress, initially behind WordPress Automatic, and these guys agreed to put it into the foundation. That was a very smart move, because now it allows other companies to start providing services, plugins, themes, what have you, for WordPress and feel safe about their investment, and that Automatic, as the original creator, will not pull again the rug away from under their feet. If you don't create a foundation, things can go wrong. So here are a couple of examples where in different ways things went wrong. So the first example is the Twiki software for wikis. And here a startup also called Twiki tried in some sense to find a balance between its commercial interests and its investment and the interests of the community around Twiki. But it wasn't resolved in such a way that a large part of the community, some part of the community felt satisfied, commercial service providers around Twiki. So they forked and created a fork of Twiki under the name of FOSS Wiki, and that's what they left to. So today, both communities are probably not as strong as the original Twiki community. Both are alive, but well, together they probably would have been stronger. The second example is MySQL, which started out as an example of what I later discuss as single vendor open source software. So MySQL, after the purchase by Oracle, obviously created the fear that maybe Oracle, with its flagship product, Oracle, the database, may not be supporting MySQL as much. So it was forked into MariaDB, which is not a problem, as the CEO of MySQL used to say. At any given point of time, there were 40 forks of the software, just doesn't matter. But MariaDB was a fork of the original developers who also had left the company, or the acquiring company Oracle, also first Sun and Oracle. But they were smart enough to set up an open source foundation, MariaDB Foundation, to actually properly regulate any intellectual property rights, in this case then to the MariaDB logo, DB logo, etc., etc. If Oracle had created a MySQL foundation, created proper open governance in that foundation, then this fork might not have happened, and MySQL might have kept flourishing, but then maybe it wasn't in the interest, or is not in the interest of Oracle to continue MySQL. Another example is a fork, like from Twiki to FOSSWiki, from OwnCloud to Nextcloud. Both are now viable companies. OwnCloud announced the creation of a foundation at around the time that Nextcloud split, and nobody knows, of course, the details of it, but there was a row around how a company, OwnCloud, could benefit on a business level from a software called OwnCloud while maintaining a happy community. And so Nextcloud says it wants to address that, but ultimately it's another company too. I don't think there's a Nextcloud foundation right now. Since that is a more recent split, we haven't seen the end of that yet, and we've got to wait for that. So these community forks do happen, and they are typically, folks try to avoid them, but ultimately one may have to live with it, that you now have hopefully two viable communities, or maybe one of the communities dies out. Ideally, developer foundations, in particular application developer foundations, are completely fair to everyone. That's not always possible or not always planned, and it really depends on the companies trying to join the ecosystem, and maybe also on the strength of the position of the original creator, whether they can keep some additional benefits, positional advantage, what have you. So in the case of WordPress, for example, Automatic, as the original creator of the WordPress software, still owns WordPress.com, WordPress.org, and the trademark is part of the WordPress Foundation, but WordPress.com is run by Automatic. So since many users are not able to distinguish between .com, .org, it means that Automatic owns probably the strongest marketing channel to customers that exists around the WordPress software. And of course, that may upset some in this ecosystem and keep them from joining. The Wikimedia Foundation does not allow for natural people or does not allow for any members, juristic members either, to join them for any open governance around the MediaWiki software. There is some sort of community, but it's not regulated. If the Wikimedia Foundation says one thing and the community wants another thing, well, the community doesn't have a handle. The Wikimedia Foundation has the rights and employs the core people. And MariaDB, well, the foundation and the company have the same name, so there is some connection in the minds of customers that makes this a stronger marketing channel, where folks will go to mariadb.com rather than to any other, and less likely than any other company in the MariaDB ecosystem. So these small things are things that original project creators typically can maintain to get some leg up. If they overdo it, they are hurting the ecosystem because other people will want to stay out. But depends on how attractive the ecosystem is, how badly perceived it will be by other companies that there are special provisions for the founders. Okay, so open source foundations, in particular in this application developer foundation scenario, this is a speculation of mine, perhaps a way of building a strong partner ecosystem for the original creator. Building a partner ecosystem is hard. What it means is you have perhaps some product and now you want partners who provide implementation services of your complex software with customers. These other companies will at the same time sell a license fee or a subscription fee to the original software while they perform their implementation services, meaning they customize the software to customer needs. Now, that's a good pairing. There's a lot of software products that are set up like this. The leading example, of course, is SAP and its huge partner ecosystem. But getting to that partner ecosystem is hard. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So first of all, the software vendor at the center of the ecosystem needs to inspire trusts in potential partners, needs to inspire the trust that it won't screw them by doing some things that are against their interests. So there needs to be a very clean separation on what's the product and what are partner services delivered in addition to the product. Any such partnering also needs to make clear how money is being made for both the original product vendor, software vendor, and maybe the consulting partner company. So there needs to be a clear separation. None can eat too badly into the other guy's revenues. So there needs to be a believable business model of how revenues are spread out or shared. And finally, since things change, there needs to be a way to look at the future risk or at the risk of the vendor turning on its partners if, say, the times are getting tough. And so there needs to be a believable promise by the vendor that it will not screw its partners over time. So all of these things somehow need to be communicated to partners so that they make the investment of learning about the software, starting to build building up a sales force for it, etc., etc. Often the vendor has to financially support that, so it comes at a serious cost to the vendor. Well, the proposed hypothesis here, because we don't really know yet whether it's true, it's research that needs to be done, is, well, maybe creating an open source foundation is the perfect way to address these issues of trust, profit, and risk. Because, well, as part of an open source foundation, you are establishing a publicly visible track record of conducting your business around the software in the open. So you do create trust visibly over time, documented on the internet. Then, as part of the foundation, you set up the rules and regulations, and also possibly how money flows, if money flows. So it's clear how profits are made, and it gives any service provider a way out, for example, to decouple themselves from the original software vendor who provided the initial version of the open source software. Finally, the foundation gives any interested company a structured way of managing the future risks of changes, because by way of the foundation, they can become involved in the governance, in the roadmap where the product is headed, which they typically can't, at least not in a direct way, if they are working with a closed source software vendor. But as I said, I'm speculating that this is actually what's going on with some, not necessarily all, but with some application developer foundations, and time will tell. Okay, so let's move on to the second form of developer foundation, the what I tentatively call the platform developer foundations. And you can see some examples here. There are probably less developer foundations than platform developer foundations than there are application developer foundations. The examples you see here are the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation. These are all the original, the older open source foundations. And then newer ones like OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, Cloud Native Computing. Open Daylight, I believe, is a project of the Linux Foundation, so it's not a standalone open source foundation. And you can see a lot is going on in the cloud computing space, meaning that companies realized they need to join forces and felt that an open source foundation, a developer foundation, is the right way to do that. Then we have here the Open HAB Foundation. That's a foundation for software for home automation. Open Robotics is for software for robots. And then you have two programming language foundations that steer the future of Perl. So that's the Perl Foundation, and then the Python Software Foundation. We also have Node.js here as the Node.js Foundation, which manages the future of the Node.js web server. All right, so we see here that companies realized maybe we don't need our own foundation, we'll just join the Linux Foundation. And so smartly, the Linux Foundation and also the Eclipse Foundation, as we'll see later, are making it possible to have some lightweight form of foundation. Officially, it's a project, but some lightweight form of foundation under the hood of the Linux Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation with their own governance. So now both of these, Linux and Eclipse Foundation, allow projects to have their own modified governance to deal with the peculiarities of their project and their domain. So let's try to understand these platform developer foundations. Maybe foremost, the primary example is Linux. We already discussed how Linux helps perhaps take a bite out of the revenue that Microsoft would gain by being a replacement, if they can, for the operating system, leaving more money for anything that builds on it. So you can argue that Microsoft Windows, when it became so strong and dominant in the 90s, caused the reaction of Linux being pitched against it as an alternative, again to make sure that anyone who's not Microsoft can build on Linux and get more of the wallet of the customer. And so that led the not only creation of Linux, which may have started as a hobby project, but led the commercialization and putting Linux under the guidance of what eventually became the Linux Foundation. There were actually various groups and foundations that struggled to support Linux, and ultimately it became the Linux Foundation. So after the Open Source Development Lab and the Free Standards Group and what have you, today we now have the Linux Foundation as one of the major open source foundations, maybe perhaps one of the largest. So when you look at the Linux Foundation, it's quite amazing who's a member. Here are not all, but the top 9 members of the Linux Foundation. And these are the platinum members who pay more, or who pay $500,000 annually just to be, well, a platinum member of the Linux Foundation. It means they are involved with the various activities on a strategic level. It does not mean that any of this money flows into development. So all of the investment into software development, that's separate resources by these companies and others. The 500,000 are only for the operations of the foundation itself, for its projects, for its employees, and nothing of it goes to the actual software development. I already pointed out how perhaps, or how quite obviously, the Linux Foundation is a reaction to the growing dominance of Microsoft Windows. We've seen this a couple of times now, actually. Similarly, you can argue that the Eclipse Foundation was created to save the Java ecosystem, or to build out the Java ecosystem as an alternative to Microsoft's Visual Studio and C# programming language, because, as they say, developers rule the world, and if you've got the developers, then you win in terms of application development. So Java was basically saved, not by Sun or Oracle, but by IBM, originally leading the Eclipse Foundation and creating a strong ecosystem for Java tooling with the original Eclipse IDE and so forth. We saw another example of what I call here the ganging up on the 800-pound gorilla, meaning having industry join forces to fight back any single potentially dominant competitor who is about to take over a market. So the most recent example is probably OpenStack, as a reaction to Amazon Web Services starting to dominate in the cloud computing space. So now we have AWS and all its services provided on the net, and then we have OpenStack as a software that is being provided as a software backbone, infrastructure, and platform as a service by various providers. None of these providers, IBM, Rackspace, what have you, would be able to compete with Amazon Web Service on its own, but jointly, by developing OpenStack, they believe they can compete with AWS. So then, we now need to look at what that actually means. Investing in an open source developer foundation, building on its products, to understand then how to set up such a developer foundation and make sure that those initial motivations actually play out properly. There's no point in investing in Linux if it can't be used as a proper alternative to Windows. If the software is too bad, is not good enough, then all that investment will be for nothing. So the way I look at it is in 2 layers. There is the community open source software that is managed by the developer foundation. And then there are ancillary additional products and services and consulting engagements that one can sell to customers on top of the community open source software. So if you will, the community open source software itself is free. After all, it's provided under an open source license. And but whatever you put on top of that, you can price any way you want. So for that, you need to manage the community open source software. And so there's the developer foundation who in one form or another owns the open source software, all right, maybe by way of trademarks or what have you. But because it has clear bylaws, it has open governance, it's actually a representative of the larger community interested in the open source software. So owning it only means it's a steward in a sensible way of it. The developer foundation delegates the management of the development of the community software to project management committees, as they're typically called. And then we have various software developers, contributors, committers who contribute and who develop the community open source software. These software developers are often employed by those companies who base their products and services on this community open source software. So here then you see some sort of so here you can see the second layer with some commercial product in the middle, which is heavily based on the community open source software. How it differs, depends on the specifics of the foundation and the software. For example, if the community open source software is permissively licensed, then the commercial product can have all kinds of additional proprietary extensions, which is usually how it's done. So then the software user uses the commercial product. They don't go to the foundation. They go to a particular software vendor who they pay for a license to the combined product. And then the software user, maybe the company, the customer also pays a consulting firm to implement the software in its data center. Not shown here is a service provider. If the software user doesn't want to operate the software themselves, they could perhaps use a service provider who runs the software for the software user in the service provider's data center. So that would be then the typical trinity here of software vendor, service provider, and consulting firm providing a commercial product, a viable, whole commercial product to the software user. Of course, these three domains, the original product and its license fees, the provision as a service, and the consulting, meaning the implementation and customization, all of that could be done by a single company and maybe different departments of that one company. Now, as software vendors engage and use an open source software product, various challenges come about. One of them is a product management challenge. For any piece of code that a developer at some company programs, they have to think about whether they want to put that into the open source project or keep it proprietary if the license permits that. And that's a real challenge because the company needs to very clearly and cleanly understand what its competitive edge and differentiation is, and based on that, it can decide. A product manager has to decide. But often this is left to developers, and developers tend to do what's technically right, and sometimes that means putting competitively differentiating features into the main community open source code base, so that what could have been competitively differentiating is no longer competitively differentiating. So you can see this in stages here. Company one is not part of the ecosystem, so they don't benefit from community open source. In order to provide the whole product, they have to do more than company 2, 3, or 4. Now, company 3 bases its product on a larger part of, or maybe 2 sensible community open source projects, while company 2 only uses 1. So company 3 saves more costs and has a better perhaps offering, or has it more cheaply. And finally, company 4, I call it proprietary open source here, in some way keeps things proprietary and does not properly play the open source game. They may gain an advantage that way, but they may also be annoying the other people in the ecosystem, and maybe the foundation undercuts or prevents any such behavior. Looking at more at how foundations work, let me go back to one of the original challenges. Both the Apache and Eclipse Foundation are very well done open source foundations, but even those two, which are broad, have broad support, allow for natural people in some form or another to participate, are honest open source foundations, even those differ. And here's the most prominent difference expressed by what is more important to them. And it is that to the Apache Software Foundation, community is more important than code. So they will always favor support and keep alive projects with a good community and care less about code. While to Eclipse, it's more the pragmatic, code is more important over community. This boils down to simply things: can you have a project leave an incubator and gain more visibility, say on the project list of any of these foundations, if there isn't a vibrant community? So and only the Eclipse Foundation could say we could possibly accept a code dump without a strong community, though of course they wouldn't do it that easily. While the Apache Software Foundation has very strict rules around, for example, committer diversity. If there isn't a viable community, a diverse community, they will simply not accept a project as an Apache project. It will never leave an incubator, the Apache incubator, assuming it even made it into the incubator. So since these are these two important foundations, here you see a small comparison. Officially, Apache is a 501c3 for public benefit, while the Eclipse Foundation is a 501c6, which is a consortium for member benefit. Practically, this actually doesn't make much of a difference. People sometimes point it out, but pragmatically speaking, they are both good open source foundations. The Apache Software Foundation accepts natural people. I'm not sure whether the Eclipse Foundation does that. It's mostly companies who are members of the Eclipse Foundation. So the Apache Software Foundation only accepts natural people. Both are, so Apache doesn't really have membership fees. It gets sponsored. It's clearly not making nearly as much money as the Eclipse Foundation, which has a reasonable member fee price list and is making a fair bit of money there. As a consequence, the Apache Software Foundation has 1.5 employees, while the Eclipse Foundation, I think, these days 20-25 people. Also not huge, and again, none of these does any software development. That's the project users who do that and developers who do that. But it is clearly a financial difference. The Apache Software Foundation, that's community over code, basically accepts any project if it has a good community. The Eclipse Foundation initially only accepted Java, so I believe these days it accepts also pretty much any technology. The business models of these foundations have also been evolving, and in particular the Eclipse Foundation is business savvy, and like the Linux Foundation, I think I already mentioned that, is now accepting what's called industry working groups, which is some sort of smaller open source foundation under their hoods, so that those don't have to incorporate as one. Well, let me go over how to set up and organize and structure an open source developer foundation. I will not spend too much time on it. There's an article that you can read, and it's also fairly boring administrative governance material. In any case, a developer foundation needs a vision and a mission. The scope and opportunity needs to be defined, and ultimately it needs to be financially viable since it will be incorporated, so it needs some sort of business model. We did some research on that, and what follows is a blueprint of a developer foundation. It has these various different aspects, ranging from underlying philosophy, through how to handle intellectual property, through all the governance issues, processes for that, all the way to financing and back office operations. So in general, in the bylaws, typically, you need to define the vision and mission of the foundation. You choose a particular incorporation, typically for public benefit or for member benefit, and incorporate accordingly. You need to define whether you want natural people or heuristic people to be members of the foundation. And you typically create different member levels, grades of membership. Under philosophy, I've grouped how the foundation sees the use or exploitation of its resources, that is the community open source software. What form of property is it? How strongly do you want to regulate it? So would you choose a copyleft license or a permissive license? And based on these, you choose. Basically, if you have a strong sense of community, where you don't want too much flexibility in the business models built on it, you use a copyleft license. If you want companies to give back if they touch the community code, you choose a weak reciprocal license. And if you want to broadly allow for proprietary exploitation, you use a permissive license like MIT or BSD or Apache. Certainly you have to think about the transparency. Ideally, you choose an open project model, but some actually do have a closed software development model where you only in intervals lay open what you have done rather than developing and managing in the open. Intellectual property needs to be managed. What are the licenses? Is the software the software needs to be made license compliant? Patents need to be managed. You actually may have to. So most foundations require a copyright transfer to the foundation, so that the foundation really is a proper representative of the project, legally speaking. All of this needs to be managed, all of this needs to be defined, all of this requires its own legal documents that need to be made available. You also clarify, if any, what the warranties or anything are that you provide to your members. The overall governance has various aspects. How do you set up the board? How do they rule? What is the extent of any processes or rules and regulations they may put in place? You may want to make it vary by type, natural or heuristic. You may want to increase or introduce various membership levels based on who you want to have more power than others. Ideally, you don't make it too complicated, but sometimes having different levels does make sense. Well, beyond the overall foundational governance, you need project governance. That's, of course, where a lot of the action is. So how do you set up that career path? How do you manage the individual projects? What are the roles? What rights do you give them? What access to resources do you give them? How do you require software development documents itself, and how, say, roadmap decisions are being made? You need to provide the tools for software development, etc. Also, you need to lay out in the bylaws whether, say, an executive director of the foundation has a particular right to step in if something goes wrong. We'll shortly touch on this as part of potential dysfunctions to be observed in open source foundations. Well, everything needs money, certainly if you have people employed by the foundation, so you need to set up your membership fees if that's the way how you want to finance yourself, or simply how to accept donations and sponsorships. That's up to you, but it needs to work, of course, in the end. Also, the foundation typically operates the infrastructure, but doesn't have to. Maybe some member will do it, maybe the member will get compensated, maybe they do it for free, etc. Okay, so a final word on things that can go wrong here. A common thing is that sometimes if there's a strong foundation, someone will try to take over a project and make it the marketing channel. That doesn't happen easily or at all, say, in the Apache Software Foundation, because the initial diversity of committers ideally means that no single company can easily take over a particular project and after that keep everyone out, meaning come committer elections, he will not accept anyone who's not from the company. Such misuse should, of course, be stopped and avoided. Same thing or similar things if you allow for too much influence through special membership levels, you are asking for trouble, as people will be unhappy with the organization. OpenStack, as an example, is currently struggling over a complicated structure which gives people perhaps too much influence by way of bylaws, and maybe these things need to be straightened out to have a more fair and therefore also a more attractive ecosystem for additional new members, new companies. The way I see it developed is that by way of open source developer foundations, we are building more and more commoditized infrastructure layers on which we can then build innovative applications. So open source, as it is slowly replacing closed source software in the infrastructure, is actually pushing outwards the innovation frontier that we can have, and thereby is helping us all, if you will, have a more exciting technical future. Okay, so looking back over this session, we looked at what open source developer foundations are, the two variants of application versus platform developer foundations that we find there, how they are defined, lots of examples, and why companies engage in these foundations. How to do them is another topic shortly addressed here, and how the governance should look like, and of course also some challenges that might be waiting for open source developer foundations on the way. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time.